Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining from, and welcome to the first of several series of conversations from 70 Faces Media about pegged to Israel's 75th birthday, Israel 75. Today, we're going to be talking about Aliyah, how the face of immigration to Israel is changing. My name is Uri Heilman. I'm a journalist and a longtime reporter for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency and some other outlets. And I'm joined today by three wonderful, intelligent, experienced American immigrants to Israel. Yossi Klein Halevi, author and senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Abby Dauber, who is co-author of the book Stories for the Sake of Argument, a longtime educational leader and currently a rabbinical student at the Israeli program run by the Shalom Hartman Institute and the Midrashah in Oranim. Rabbi Dov Littman, who was elected to the Knesset in 2013, making him the first American-born Knesset member in 30 years. He's the author of books about Judaism and Israel, and he's now the founder and CEO of Yad LeOlim, an NGO that assists Olim from all over the world. So welcome, all three of you, and welcome to the participants and to the audience. Thanks for joining us. What I'd love to do today is hear a little bit from each of you about why you chose to make this very counterintuitive move to Israel from the United States. Most American Jews don't even consider doing this kind of a thing. A lot of American Jews can't understand why someone would do it. You've each moved in different decades. Maybe we'll start with I don't want to say the oldest, the longest Ole, Yossi. You moved to Israel in 1982. We know at the time you were a Jewish extremist. You wrote memoirs of a Jewish extremist not long after. Tell us a little bit about what motivated you to leave the Golden Medina and move to Medinat Israel.
Well, hi everyone. I am the oldest, and that's in Jewish tradition. That's a badge of honor. So I'm trying to wear it in that way. And you know, to answer your question, Uri, for me the question was what took me so long. I was almost 30 when I moved to Israel. My first trip to Israel was the summer of 1967. I was 14. And it was love at first sight. And I knew that summer that I have to live in Israel. In fact, I told my father, we went together. I said, you go home, you go back to Brooklyn, and I'm staying for high school. And it'll work out fine. I'll find a place. I'll just, and I was totally serious. And I was beside myself when he vetoed it, and I knew that I would go back, and I expected to go back much sooner. And life gets in the way as it often does for many people who plan Aliyah. And in my case, it meant delaying till I was nearly 30, which did have repercussions in terms of my ability to fully integrate into Israel. Maybe that's a separate question. But in terms of why I went, I couldn't keep away. And I think that in the end, that's the only reason that makes sense to leave America and move to the Middle East. Because we actually, and Olim don't always internalize this until it's too late, until we're already there. But we're not just moving to the Jewish state, we're also moving to the Middle East. And to leave America for the Middle East really requires a very credible personal answer. It's yes, there's the ideals, yes, there's there was this deep sense of privilege, and I use that word in the most positive sense of the meaning, this sense of privilege of being alive at a moment where you actually can be part of a Jewish state. And how could I not join Israel? So there was that. But more deeply, it was, I didn't care about any other place the way I cared about Israel. I didn't care about the country I was living in to the extent that I cared about Israel. And I realized that I was living a kind of anomaly. And I wanted to normalize my life. I wanted Israel to stop being this thing, this cause, and to just be part of normal life. And so in some ways, I think that, and I wouldn't have phrased it that way when I made Aliyah. I would have given all the big answers. But I think that in some way, for me, the most enduring answer is that I just love Israeli society. I love Israelis, despite what's happening today. And I just cared too much about the place to deprive myself of the spiritual energy and sustenance that I get from just speaking Hebrew with my kids, just from being part of trying to figure out who we are as a people.
Mm-hmm. You moved to Israel still in the wake of the euphoria of 67, the challenge of the 73 Yom Kippur War, but at a time when the American immigrants who were moving to Israel, many of them were motivated by ideology, by excitement, by exactly what you described. Then around the time that you moved to Israel, Israel entered into the morass of Lebanon, and later the Intifada of 93, and then the second Intifada, and that's where we come to Rabbi Littman, who moved to Israel in the early 2000s, kind of in the wake of the second Intifada. It was a very different time. Rabbi Littman, tell me a little bit about what prompted you to move to Israel and why then?
Sure, it's very interesting that, I grew up in a religious home, going to Jewish day school, and I was taught so many commandments that I have to do this, I have to do that. Somehow along the way, they forgot the religious component about living in the land of Israel and how central that is to the Jewish people. I wish growing up that would have been taught to me a little bit in terms of how central this is on a religiously observant level. So I can't say that I moved to Israel because I'm some kind of a righteous person who was trying to fulfill anything on a religious commandment level. But what ultimately led to it, there's a commentary called the Maharal from Prague in the 18th century, and he says that anybody who moves to the land of Israel, leaving the comforts of wherever their homes are, and comes to Israel, he says it's deep in their DNA from Abraham, who made this crazy move from his hometown to a foreign land, to a new land. And what basically happened, I was here in November 2003 as a chaperone on a school trip to Israel. And I was actually stunned. You're mentioning the Intifada. I was expecting to be coming into some kind of a war zone and people walking around scared and society shut down. And I didn't see that. I saw a flourishing, I'm sure that people were very jaded and had a very difficult time during the Intifada, but life was going on and I was seeing people living overall very happy lives here in Israel. And something pulled at me at a very, very deep level. And there was this moment where you just ask yourself, why am I raising my children in the United States? I had nothing against the United States, but when I had the opportunity to raise them in Israel. And that's what led to the process of looking for work and ultimately making Aliyah. And, building off of what Yossi said, for me, the craziness was obviously leaving the comforts of home. I was living in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is where I was raised and where I grew up, and we were raising our family there. The comforts of being able to sit back on a Sunday afternoon to watch my football team instead of calculating what time in the morning I have to watch it, and all the other comforts that come with living in America. But I can tell you this, and I'm sure we'll talk about the challenges, but greatest decision I could have ever made in my life, greatest decision that any person can make in their life. And the moment we got here, I was in education, just this feeling of being part of something meaningful and being part of the destiny of the Jewish people, instead of kind of just continuing whatever our story is outside of the land of Israel and not even knowing where that's going to go. But the motivation was just a deep spiritual inner pull, along with seeing people living such meaningful, happy lives in the wake of a very difficult time during the Second Intifada.
Mm. There are so many questions I want to ask, but I want to give Abby a chance first to talk a little bit about her story. Abby, I know that you moved to Israel not once, but twice. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Hi. Not even that once or twice, but actually we could say 3 times if you count when my parents brought me here when I was a young child. So I give different answers, really, depending on the mood and depending on who I'm speaking with. There isn't one answer for why I came any of the times. But I'll give the answer that comes to me right now. There's a sort of cosmic, karmic fate thing that I felt that I had to correct. I'm 4th generation American, which is already pretty amazing that I'm 4th generation American. And I'm 4th generation that moved to Israel, made Aliyah, from America and moved back to the United States. So my great-grandparents moved to what was then called Palestine in the 1930s because they were Zionists. My great-grandfather was a rich man and wanted to live here, and so he came. And he brought my grandfather, who was already married to my grandmother, and they came and they lived here quite unsuccessfully. It wasn't a great time to live here in the 1930s under British mandate. Grew up on all sorts of stories of that. And so they went back. And then my parents, when I was about 1 year old, came here. Mostly, actually, they were academics and they got a position here and they thought, oh, it seemed like fun. And that didn't work out. And they went back home. And I very much grew up on the story of like their failed Aliyah and how much they wanted to be here and how actually betrayed they felt by the country and how saddened they were by what they called the betrayal. And they never came back. My parents would not visit this country growing up. They wouldn't come.
Wow.
And when I was 29 years old, I was married and I had my first child, and I was offered a job here, kind of miraculously. I had always thought maybe I'd come to live here, but I was offered a job. And I looked at my husband, who we'd been married for barely 2 years, and we had talked about Israel from the start. We both had reasons we thought maybe we'd be here. And we said, well, try it. And that was 2007, and we came. And in 2011, for all sorts of reasons, we moved back to the States. So there we go. The family story was relived in me. And it was really my husband who, the minute we got on the flight back to the States, we looked at each other and we both said, why are we going back? We really want to be in Israel. But we had good reasons for going back, mostly professional reasons. And so we went back, but my husband pushed. And in 2018, we came back here now with 4 children. We live in Jerusalem. And the coming back, I mean, I say, right, was cosmic in some way. Like I needed to make this tikkun. I needed to fix this long time family story of the back and forth. But ultimately, it's the deep emotional connection that I have here. And I have to the people here in a very interesting way that's hard to describe in any rational sense.
Thank you, Abby. You know, as I listen to your story, I think about how much Aliyah has changed over the years. You kind of accidentally stumbled into Aliyah, embraced it, you know, back and forth. Yossi, you felt this call that you couldn't resist your whole life about being a Jew. And Rabbi Littman, you had that bolt of lightning experience when you came in the early 2000s. Do you, Yossi, when you think about current Olim, do you feel like, oh, I have a lot in common with these people? You know, these are people who are coming 40 years after you came. Most Olim today from North America are moving to these majority English-speaking communities in places like Jerusalem or Beit Shemesh, Ra'anana, Modi'in. It's a very different kind of Aliyah. They're going back and forth. Their kids are going to summer camp in the US. Obviously, this is not the case for everybody. Many of them are working remotely, so they're keeping US hours. When you look at these Olim, do you think like, yeah, they're just like me, or is there some kind of disconnect there for you?
It's an interesting question. I listening to your story, Abby, I love your story. And I think it's a very American Jewish Aliyah story because there's something about the uniqueness of the American experience for Jews that creates this pull. And the fact, as you mentioned, Uri, that it's now a fairly typical model to see people going back and forth, sending their kids to summer camps in America. Sarah and I, my wife, Sarah and I made Aliyah pretty much in the last decade of the old Israel. Israel really entered the modern era in the early 1990s. When we moved to Israel, I sound like one of these old pioneers, when we moved to Israel, we were draining the swamps and, we all got malaria. You couldn't get a phone. It took 2 years to wait for a phone to be installed because it was a socialist economy. And the moment that they privatized the phone company, literally the next day, suddenly there was a glut of phones and you could get a phone within hours, So it was really the old Israel. To call the United States was a project. You had to go to the post office if you didn't have a phone. It's really hard to describe how remote America felt from Israel in the 1980s. And that, of course, changed very quickly. So, but when we went there, we really thought we were leaving America. And that meant we didn't know when we would see our parents. We had to wait for them. Of course, we had no money. Nobody we knew had money in the Israel of the 1980s, certainly not Olim. And, Sarah and I used to joke that we moved to Israel to raise our standard of living. That was funny in the 1980s. It's not a joke today. There are people who are actually coming to Israel for that reason, or that's one of the reasons. So it was a totally different Israel. And but look, I'm very much a part of the Edah Amerikait, the American. There's no translation for that into English. For the American, the ethnically American Jewish community, and that's my tribe. That's my Israeli tribe. I'm very proud of that tribe. I feel that every American Jew who comes here has something unique to offer and is making a very important statement, which is that Israel really is the project of the whole Jewish people. It's not just about safe refuge. It's about creating the next stage of Jewish civilization. And I think that's why most American Jews come here. We don't come here to seek refuge from persecution. We come here because we're excited by this project of the Jewish people reconstituting itself. And we want to be part of that project. And yes, it is a spiritual project, regardless of where one positions oneself on the religious spectrum. So, so I do think that there's a particular solidarity that American Olim have. Sorry.
Do you think that, and this is a question for all of you really, that there's a reason for an American to come who does not feel that spiritual pull or who isn't religious? Abby, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give this is the most banal, maybe, but also most practical reason: health insurance. And I don't mean that from a political perspective. Like, I know we can talk politically about whether, what do we call it in America? I forgot, the term escapes me. Universal healthcare, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I'll say that here in Israel, I don't have to think about, I have 4 children. I don't have to think about what it's going to cost me to get medical care, even with the best insurance in America. It's like, and it's not just about the expense, but it's also about how things are streamlined. Yes, I might have to, God forbid, I end up in the hospital. I have to share a room, in some places in the States you don't have to. But the streamlined, what I find to be streamlined care, and also like just cheaper, is an incredible thing. that's right. If you're saying not religious Jews, so we will put Jewish day school out of there because that's assumption they're not going there. That's one reason. I also think there's something about just being a majority people, which we can talk again about politically, how that may or may not change over the years, over the coming years. But I think the idea that the holidays are my holidays, whether or not I celebrate them in the most religious observant sense. The fact that like Hanukkah, which is pretty universal for most Jews, that's what, that's what's in the window shops. And we say Hanukkah Sameach, Happy Hanukkah, not Merry Christmas. There's something really wonderful about that, and a sense of being at home in many, many ways.
And I appreciate, for those of you, for our panelists who are in Jerusalem today, they're celebrating Purim because Purim in Jerusalem and ancient walled cities is celebrated the day after Purim on Shushan Purim. So happy Purim, and thanks for taking time and maybe moderating your alcohol intake for this session. Rabbi Littman, truly there is something unique about North American Olim and the way that they have to be handled. If you talk to other people who work in this field, they talk about how they need a white glove treatment or hand-holding in a way maybe that other Olim don't. Although in a way there's some irony there, because maybe a Ukrainian family needs more hand-holding than an American family. You fell into this work, and maybe that's an inaccurate description, but I remember after you retired from the Knesset, you started offering this ad hoc assistance to Olim, and it evolved into this organization. Tell me a little bit about the work that you do and why Americans need this kind of assistance. And I know that you don't just help Americans, you help Olim generally, but what is it about North American Aliyah that requires a different approach?
So first of all, when my work with Olim actually began when I was elected to the Knesset in 2013. It was announced in the media that I was the first American-born MK in 30 years. And all of a sudden, my office became a Olim asking for assistance. You know, they estimated there were about 250,000 English-speaking Olim in the country at the time. And whether they voted for my party or not, every one of them thought I was their congressman in the Knesset. And we're used to that kind of service of there's someone thousands of requests for help, of navigating bureaucracy in every possible ministry. And when I left the Knesset, I thought that's the end of that assistance that I could provide. But I would say every day I still got a handful of people asking me for help, and I still knew the ministers, I still knew the Knesset members, I knew how the government works. So I tried to help people voluntarily, even after I wasn't an MK. And what happened was when COVID started and people needed help getting permits to enter Israel, so that handful all of a sudden became 50, then it became 100. And then it reached a point where I was getting more than 700 requests for help a day from people needing to get into Israel for their children's weddings or, God forbid, funerals and births and all kinds of issues that were coming up. And it literally became my full-time occupation without it being an occupation. And I would also go to the government meetings and raise the voice of the Olim. And I would say to them, make whatever decisions you have to make for health reasons, but you have to have some kind of a mechanism or infrastructure to enable Olim to function with their families going back and forth. You know, Yossi mentioned when he made Aliyah, there wasn't that assumption that relationship would be there. When we make Aliyah today, we do expect that relationship to be there, and it was destroying people. So that's what led to the establishment Olim a little more than a year and a half ago, where we have two branches. One is government relations, because Olim do not feel that anyone in government is there to bring their issues to the Knesset and to the ministers. And we try to, as a apolitical organization, just bring coalition and opposition together to work for Olim. And then also absorption advisors. Just to mention, you asked about Americans versus the rest of the world. We've had over 30,000 requests for help from Olim from 22 different countries in about 20 months. So I think that all Olim are in this place where you're overwhelmed by the Hebrew language and all these documents. And the most basic thing, like opening a bank account, which was so easy in your hometown, now becomes so much more difficult. The thing that I would say for Americans is many of the Olim who are coming Western English style speaking Olim who are not running away from something. They're not seeking refuge, and they're coming for idealistic reasons. they come from a strong place, a culture which they're used to navigating. Many of them are leaders in their communities of some kind or another. And now they're just lost in this gaping hole of Israeli bureaucracy and not knowing how to navigate Israeli culture. And that's where Yad L'Olim tries to come in and help and just be that hand to help them through that entire process. But somebody making Aliyah has to know that it's not going to be simple. It's filled with challenges. It's worthwhile. And you have to have that built-in strength of character that says, I will make it through. And also, of course, turn to Yad L'Olim and other organizations for assistance along the way.
And just to give the participants of this session some context, I want to point out that if you look at the statistics from 2022, the year that just ended, about 74,500 Olim came to Israel, a real banner year for immigration, but 82% of them were from Russian-speaking countries. So that's basically Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. 43,500 from Russia, 15,000 or so from Ukraine, and over 2,000 from Belarus. Just a reminder that most Aliyah to Israel, in this case, northward of 80% are from people really fleeing a war. In 2019, the last year that was uninterrupted by the pandemic, the total number of Olim was 35,000, about 40% of last year's total. And of those, about 2/3 were from Russia or Ukraine. And the number of North American Olim is almost always between 3,000 and 4,000, give or take. Last year in 2022, there were 3,215 from the United States and 503 from Canada, compared to, by the way, 3,380 from Western Europe. So the number of American Jews who make Aliyah is still a fraction of those who choose to make Aliyah from places like France or the UK, even the countries of South America. Is there, one of the goals of Zionist education traditionally has been to encourage Aliyah. Is there a way to move the needle on Aliyah through marketing, or should Zionist education be focusing on something else? Anybody who wants to take that?
Rabbi, you're the educator. Go for it.
We're all educators.
We're all educators.
We're all educators. I'll just say very personally, I can't imagine too much of it. I can imagine a marketing approach to like why to make Aliyah. I can't really personally imagine educating about Aliyah as the thing to do. Meaning I can, as Rabbi Dov mentioned, like we could certainly talk about all the texts, right, that our Jewish tradition that say moving to Israel, making Aliyah is the thing to do, and all the extra mitzvot, commandments that one can keep and observe while we're here. But that doesn't speak to most Jews, particularly in North America, who are not religiously observant, and those are not their motivating factors. So I'm much more interested in the connection that Jews outside of Israel have to Israel, and what mostly is shown in the statistics is that the connection is not good and has gotten worse over time, especially recently, that the connection to Israel, particularly from North American Jews, is weakening for all sorts of reasons. And so I'm much more interested in, like, let's first start with, okay, what would a strengthened relationship look like? What would it mean like to look up to Israel, to think that Israel is a place that was worthy of attachment, of maybe even love, if one can love a country, which is a whole question in and of itself, especially from a distance, or the sense that it's their homeland in some way, even if it's not their home. And I'm much more interested in that than trying to bring people here. I'm very in favor of people coming and living here, but I don't know if it's something that it can educate towards exactly.
Rabbi Littman, I know that you don't just provide assistance, but you also market Aliyah. How do you do that?
Well, I don't believe that a marketing campaign is the way to do it. I don't think anybody's going to make Aliyah because they saw a sign inspiring them to come to Israel. But I do believe, as an educator, as someone who has gone through the day school system in the United States and also taught in that system. And this is not just for religious people. I actually believe as a child that I could have been swept up and caught up in the magnitude of what's happening here. We were exiled from our homeland 2,000 years ago and went from country to country and continent to continent and persecuted. And every single one of our ancestors on Yom Kippur and Passover said next year in Jerusalem, and they believe that time will come. And now it's happening before our eyes. And that to me, nobody ever portrayed it that way. No one ever described it to me that way. It was, there's a country over there where people, and I think that there is a way to get young Jews who are looking for a way outside of the religious framework to express their Judaism and feel connected to who they are, to make them to inspire them about that story, and most importantly, bring them to Israel. A Birthright, in my opinion, which is a wonderful project, it's too late. They're already in college where they've been exposed to everything that I see on college campuses, the anti-Israel rhetoric, where they're told to choose between Zionism over here and human rights and social justice over here. So they all choose the social justice and the human rights. But if they're in Israel at a younger age, in some kind of an educational framework, and they see it with their own eyes, they're in a very different place once they go to college. And I think they really will have that emotional or spiritual connection, which hopefully could lead them to actually think about incorporating Israel into their future plans. I just don't know that North American Jewry is interested in that agenda. I'm suggesting a way to do it.
Yeah.
I just don't know if there's really an educational agenda or interest in inspiring our young people to make Israel their home.
I think that in addition to Dove's approach, it's important, especially in light of what's happening in Israel. And I would say what's happened in Israel over the last years is to emphasize to prospective young Olim that Israel needs you. Israel's in trouble. This is a country that has an enormous amount to give, not just to the Jewish people, I think to the world, but it can't be taken for granted. And I think that in addition to the miracle, you know, a miracle is a defiance of the laws of nature, and it can't be taken for granted. And we've overhyped Israel as a miracle and left out the fine print. The fine print is that miracles can end. Miracles are not something that are necessarily self-sustaining. And Israel is not going to be self-sustaining if Jews walk away from it. And so I think that it's an opportunity for us to present Israel's problems as a challenge to young diaspora Jews to help us figure this out. You know, we're not doing such a great job at the moment, and it can't just be left to it. Israel isn't only the problem of Israelis to figure out.
I'm glad you brought that up, Yossi. I want to talk about the current moment and encourage our audience members to send any questions or comments that they have in the chat window. I want to ask you about the current moment, Yossi. You were mentioned actually in today's column by Tom Friedman in the New York Times for an open letter that you penned several weeks ago in the Times of Israel, along with author Mati Friedman and author and Shalem College leader Daniel Gordis, telling Americans to basically try to obstruct the actions of Israel's current government. You wrote, "When an Israeli government strays beyond what your commitments to liberal democracy can abide, you have both the right and responsibility to speak up." Should American Jews who are not in Israel be interfering in Israeli politics? I mean, seems like an extraordinary step. Maybe it's only in these extraordinary times, or generally speaking, should U.S. Jews have a voice in what happens in Israel?
When it comes to security issues, we obviously have the last say. But even in security issues, I want to hear from Jews around the world, whether you're right wing or left wing or centrist. I want to know what our policies look like to the rest of the Jewish people. You hold up a mirror to us, and that's precious. we are so caught in a daily grind, in a struggle against sometimes overwhelming threat, that it's hard to see ourselves. And so just on that level, even on security issues, I welcome diaspora involvement. Again, with the clear understanding that we're the ones who will make the final. But that doesn't preclude a serious conversation with diaspora Jews. And it's time for us to start treating diaspora Jews as Jewish grown-ups. And anyone who feels committed to Israel, who feels engaged with Israel, I'm willing to engage with them. So that's the first, for me, that's the first principle. And if we're serious about Israel as the state of the Jewish people, then we have to own that. And that doesn't only come with support, it also comes with the responsibility to hear critiques. So that seems to me self-evident. In this particular case, where we're fighting for the future of Israeli democracy, which I deeply believe is at stake in the coming weeks, that will have, the outcome of that struggle will have deep consequences. First of all, for the diaspora-Israel relationship. If, God forbid, we stop being a democracy, you can forget about a relationship with the diaspora outside of the Orthodox and the right, which is 15% of American Jewry, 20%. That's not good enough. That I'm not prepared 80 years after the Shoah to write off 80% of American Jewry. And sometimes when I hear people in this government speak with contempt about liberal American Jews and how we can depend on the evangelicals if we'll lose American Jewish support, thinking there's nothing more anti-Zionist than this casual contempt and willingness to write off diaspora Jews. So I want to pull diaspora Jews more deeply into a relationship with Israel. And yes, that means I insist when I speak to critics of Israel or organizations that are especially critical of Israel, what I try to lay down, the principles that I try to lay down is I welcome your involvement, but it can't only be criticism. It also has to be support. But I say the same thing to the other side of the spectrum. I welcome your support, but I also need your critical involvement. I just don't need to be flag waving and encouraging my government when it's pushing us over the abyss. I need to hear from you. I need to hear, especially from those Jewish organizations, those mainstream organizations that are out there fighting for Israel. This is no less, to my mind, no less critical in the war for Israel than pushing back against BDS.
Thank you. Rabbi Littman, did you want to add to that?
I try so hard to be as apolitical as possible in all situations. Only given the nature of the work that I do, and I'm working daily with coalition members and opposition members. And, in order to make progress for Olim, we have to work with every government is in front of us. And for now we have a government which is more right. So I'm not going to get involved in my opinion about the whole matter. I will say that when I traveled to America, especially as a Knesset member, I did struggle with a lot of the criticism that was coming. This is not during this critical juncture in history. This is more about general security issues. And I felt that a lot of the lecturing was being done by people who I felt cared about Israel, but didn't necessarily have all the information in front of them in terms of what Israel is facing. So I almost, at that point in time, kind of thought to myself that when it was religion and state issues, which were impacting how diaspora Jewry could connect in Israel, religiously, and closing the door to a large percentage of our people, then I felt that they had to raise their voices On security issues, I felt less comfortable with it, but I do understand for sure, as someone who spent most of my life outside of Israel, the necessity of a strong Israel diaspora relationship. And I do ask for Jewry and their ability to connect to Israel or defend Israel or support Israel. It's very important that we not close the door to hearing what they have to say and inviting that conversation, with the one caveat that it's not just based on headlines or things that they've seen, but people who have studied the issue, understand the issue, and there's no doubt on today's issues, people are certainly doing that.
The Israeli press has been filled in recent weeks with talk about fleeing the country, capital fleeing the country, investment fleeing the country, people asking, well, is now the time to leave? Yuval Noah Harari wrote a little piece about this a few days ago. Abby, I know that in your community in Jerusalem, there are a lot of Olim, relatively recent Olim. Has this come up? How are people responding to this moment of crisis?
So this is not a scientific poll in any way, shape, or form, but I'll just say from the Purim Suda, right, Purim dinner that I'm just coming from, where all of us were Olim, and there were about 20 of us there. There is no thought of any of us, and most of the group, I think, is fairly liberal politically and unhappy with the government. No talk of leaving. In fact, the statement that was made was, if we leave, who will be here to support the country, right? Very much in line with what Yossi was saying, is we need people that if the people around my table today were sort of are liberals and oppose the current government, and they were very much saying, if we leave, who's going to be here to sort of fight this fight? And so the sense I think that most of us have is, we need to stay and see if there's any change that we can help make. And having said that, I've also heard a couple of people who say, well, but I am going to move my money, right? I'm going to be practical. I'll stay and be activist, but I'm afraid if I leave my money here, I'm at risk financially, so I'm going to move it out. Whether they're serious or kidding, I'm actually not even sure. But I think it was an important statement. Can I just go back for 1 sec to the previous thing? Because I think, Dov, what you were talking about was in terms of the people outside of Israel speaking and your hesitation with it. I completely understand that. And I still, and especially when people don't know enough, but I have this urge to say that people in this country here in Israel don't know enough. And we talk about politics. People can say whatever they want. The question of what we do with what they say. And so I actually take a very much opposite approach, which is say as much as you want, be engaged, get angry, get excited, be passionate. Israel has a government and will do what it wants with what they hear. But right, it's different than a voter here in Israel who their vote might, makes a difference, or somebody who certainly like you has been in the government can make a difference. But people voicing their opinion, I feel that everybody has a right, especially if we think about the Jewish state as the state. There are many ways of defining what we mean by Jewish state, but if the Jewish state is the state for all Jews, for them to at least voice their opinion, I think for me is actually quite valuable.
I just want to clarify.
Go ahead.
I don't never want to be ever accused or guilty.
We're having a little trouble hearing you, Rabbi Littman, because of the internet connection.
People. I was expressing almost a vulnerability that I felt of discomfort. Yeah. And there was a process that I had to go through to recognize that, they have their opinion. And
yes.
Yeah, we have only a few minutes left for this session. I want to just again encourage any people watching this to send any questions that you have in the chat window. One of the questions that we got was, what is more frightening in Israel, the Intifada or the current government upheaval? I know, Yossi, you've written a lot about this.
I've written a lot about both frightening experiences.
Yeah, it's different kinds of fright. It's not exactly either or, but
this is worse. This is worse, much worse. I don't remember losing sleep during the Intifada. I remember being numb much of the time. I remember not remembering. at the time, I remember not being able to sort out when did the moment bombing happen and when did it all blurred. It became this kind of endless, terrifying present. That was the experience of the Second Intifada, especially those of us who were raising kids at that time in Jerusalem. Sarah and I had 2 teenagers at the time, and they were in and out of close encounters with suicide bombers. So it was terrifying. But even that experience did not literally keep me up at night the way this is. I'm not sleeping. And I know this is true for many, many people in Israel. And so, when I hear defenders of the government dismiss the protesters as privileged Ashkenazim who are just trying to maintain their privilege, I don't know what to do with myself. You can disagree with me. You can say I'm an enemy of Israel. Say whatever you want. Just don't dismiss the angst that so many of us are going through because of this moment. This, for me, is the worst moment that I've known because it's self-inflicted. And, I made Aliyah at the beginning of the first Lebanon War. It was summer 1982. And that was the first and only time when Israel was tearing itself apart during war. It was a terrible time to come. You really felt that the society was disintegrating. And yet, in retrospect, seen from this moment, I know that we were actually not in danger then of disintegrating. I hope that in the future we'll look back on this moment and say we exaggerated. The stability of Israeli society was always present. I'm not so sure. What shocks me about this moment is how quickly we've gotten to this point. This government is less than 3 months old. How has this government brought us to the abyss in so short a time? And so that makes me wonder whether this stability that I always took for granted, a kind of a foundational stability to Israeli society, was an illusion, because it apparently hasn't taken that much to set us on the verge, God forbid, of civil war.
Rabbi Littman, do you hear about this concerns about the current moment from people that you're talking to who are in the process of Aliyah, or they're more focused on the nuts and bolts? Tell me how that's come up, if at all.
It really hasn't come up very much. Most people are focused on the nuts and the bolts, and we get very few questions about this issue overall. I will say, I'm going to be the naive optimist on the panel and say that Israel has faced many, many, many threats to its existence in the last 75 years. And I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. I already see the talks of compromise and believe that something will be worked out. But I believe that, again, we have to be smart and on top of it. But I do believe that we will survive and hopefully emerge even stronger from this crisis as we have throughout our history.
Mm-hmm. I wonder also where the American Jewish Olet community is on this issue. On the one hand, you have the progressives that maybe were around your table, Abby, and in other places in Israel. On the other hand, Israeli history has been impacted by extremism from American Jewish Olim. Baruch Goldstein was an American Oleh. Kahana, who in part is the inspiration for Ben Gvir, who is part of the current moment, was also an American immigrant to Israel. It has some of, and by the way, Bibi is modeling a lot of what he does on Donald Trump. So is America here a possible, or is the American strain a stabilizing force, or is maybe is it something else? Abby, you're shaking your head.
I think, the way at least I see that analysis that you just gave, and I have no idea if I'm right about this, but my sense is that people who make Aliyah are people who make Aliyah often out of conviction, out of passion, right? In some ways, it's a crazy thing to do, to pick up one's life, depending what stage, obviously, but like to pick up one's life and to try and resettle. And it's complicated. And so you have to have often very strong convictions to do that. So I think people who have, the people you mentioned, right, are people who really had such strong convictions that they were extremists. Now, God forbid am I saying that that's what Olim are in general, but I think that there may be, some number that we would have to do some kind of real scientific analysis, but there may be some number that kind of passion, right, is something that they find. And that's why I go back to my table of saying, like, we also chose to make Elia, and I don't think we're at all extreme in that way. And actually, they're the people like that. If we could get them, if I hope that Rabbi Littman, the people that you want to educate to bring here, I really hope that you're successful, right? Because I want those people, the sort of more moderates, to come and to make that commitment to be here. So I hope, I guess I'm saying I'm hoping that that's not true, and I hope that your reading, Ori, is wrong. But I certainly don't know.
Okay. Yossi, when you moved to Israel with this extreme passion, and you've described yourself as a kid being a Jewish extremist, has Israel had a moderating influence on your outlook? And I guess I mean political outlook, because I'm sure, like, on the roads, maybe it's had a different.
Totally. Look, by the time I made Aliyah, I wasn't a follower of Meir Kahana anymore. I'd outgrown that, and for me, the transition happened when Kahana moved to Israel, and reconfigured his political position, and went from being the defender of defenseless Jews, which he was or presented himself to be in America, to being the head of the farthest right, frankly racist party in Israel. And that was my breaking point. And most of the people who were with him in the late 1960s and early 70s in America broke with him as well. Israel had a moderating impact on me in several ways. First of all, the experience of joining a society that was tearing itself apart in the middle of a war, which has always united us. And if war can't unite us, then what's left, was really a wake-up call. And that made me a centrist. I became a centrist as a result of that experience. And I've remained a centrist. That has been my political commitment, and I would say, in a deeper way, a spiritual commitment. This notion of seeking for truth across the spectrum of the Jewish people, listening to voices, and that's been my commitment as a writer. The book that took me many years to write, which in some ways was my coming of age as an Israeli, was Like Dreamers, which was about a group of paratroopers who fought in Jerusalem in 1967, one part of whom were on the right, the other part were on the left. And that really was the expression of my coming of age as a centrist. So in that sense, Israel had a very deep impact. And one last point I'd say is that when I look at some of my friends who've remained on the right, or even the hard right, American Olim who've come here, what I feel is that they have not internalized the responsibility of power, and they haven't internalized the responsibility of creating a single society out of the ingathering. The ingathering has brought Jews here from 100 different countries, to say nothing of the 20% of Israel that wasn't ingathered because they're Arab Israelis. And so this is a society that can't hold together unless a deep commitment is made to find commonality. And I think that what holds all of us together in this panel is, one way or another, that's where we are. That's where we gravitated to. When I listen to you, Dov and Abby, that's my sense, that we've whatever the nuances among us, the basic commitment is we have to consciously work to hold this country together. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart. And so to stake out a position on the far edge of any camp, whether it's left or right or religious or secular, is to risk unraveling, God forbid, the most minimal glue that keeps us together.
Wow, thank you. That's a great note on which to end. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us, Abby, Yossi, Dov, and also remind our audience that this is the first of several conversations. Tune in next week, same bat time, same bat channel, 12 p.m. on Wednesday Eastern time, 7 p.m. Israeli time, on a conversation about the relationship between the U.S. Jews and Israel. What does each owe each other, and what's the future of this relationship in an age when the two communities appear to be growing apart? We're going to be on the line with Naama Klard of the Anu Museum, Diaspora Museum, and Shaul Kellner, Professor of Sociology and Jewish Studies at Vanderbilt University. I'm Uri Heilman. Thank you from 70 Faces Media, and thank you all for your time and your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Lihitraot.